Over 6 million registered Zimbabwean voters went to the ballot today to elect their next leaders. Now, the country is holding both presidential and parliamentary elections, but the focus is on the presidential seat. Out of the 11 candidates contesting, 2 of the candidates are closely being watched. That is the incumbent President Emmerson Mnangagwa, who is seeking a second term in office, and Nelson Chamisa, the 45-year-old opposition leader, hoping to change the politics of Zimbabwe. Welcome to this special broadcast on the 2023 elections in Zimbabwe. My name is Fatia Mohamed Noor. I'll be speaking to a reporter in Harare on what's happening there at the moment. We'll be getting just that in just a bit. Right. Zimbabwe holds the general election today with just one woman presidential candidate out of 11 contenders, while the number of women running for parliamentary and council seats has improved. Gender activists say more work is needed when just one woman is running for the nation's highest office. Now, Colombo files this report from Harare.
There are doubts that Zimbabwe's ruling party will allow a credible election, but that didn't stop voters from queuing up on Wednesday morning. Many desperate for change after 2 decades of relentless economic chaos. President Emmerson Mnangagwa is seeking re-election. That's after a disputed victory in 2018. The opposition says that vote was rigged. The outcome was upheld by the Constitutional Court. Mnangagwa took over after Robert Mugabe was ousted in a 2017 military coup. But many of the hallmarks of Mugabe-era economic turmoil have remained. Runaway inflation, currency shortages and sky-high unemployment continue to make life a misery for Zimbabweans. This voter says there's no money in the banks and that she's struggling to send her kids to school. Political analysts say the unending situation could tip the contest in favour of the opposition's Citizens Coalition for Change, led by Nelson Chamisa. That is, if the vote was clean. However, after more than 4 decades in power, analysts say the ruling ZANU-PF has an unfair advantage as it wields control over the police and other key institutions. Police routinely ban opposition rallies and arrest CCC supporters. Chamisa has said Mnangagwa is not preparing to win, but plotting to rig. Speaking after voting, Mnangagwa said he was confident of victory.
If I think I'm not going to take it, then I'll be foolish. Everyone who contests, if you're going to rest to win. And precisely is what I'm doing.
The ZANU-PF and the police have denied seeking to influence the election's outcome. A ZANU-PF spokesperson has accused the opposition of being obsessed with criticising the electoral process so that they have something to say after losing. Nevertheless, intelligence firm Africa Risk Consulting, in a pre-election note, said the electoral playing field is heavily skewed in favour of the ruling party. 5 years into Mnangagwa's rule, it said, conditions have not changed much from the Mugabe era.
Right, the polls opened early today at around 6 a.m. and closed at around 7 p.m. That is Zimbabwe time, but around 8 p.m. in Kenyan time. Now, what are they voting for? They're voting for 1 president, 210 lawmakers, 1,970 local and municipal leaders. But let's take a look at some of the facts in Zimbabwe, just for us to understand. Now, some of the key facts, of course, the capital is Harare. The population is 16.3 million people. The languages include Chibarwe, English, Ndebele, Shona, and many more. Now, the life expectancy is 59 years for men and 62 years for women. The literacy level of this country is 90%, more than most African countries. The current president, of course, is Emmerson Mnangagwa, and of course he is also seeking a re-election, a second term, and this of course will be his final term, being that in the constitution in Zimbabwe they only have 2 terms. Moving on now, let's take a look at the political history of Zimbabwe. In 1889, Rhodes, a British South African company, obtained a mandate to colonize what becomes Southern Rhodesia. Now, Southern Rhodesia is the current Zimbabwe. In 1922, the British South African Company administration ends, and then now the white minority opts for self-government. So that means now the white minority took over the government. Now, between 1930 and 1960s, a lot was happening, including emergence of nationalist groups. For instance, one of the nationalist groups that came up was the Zimbabwe African People's Union, that was called ZAPU. And it was founded in 1960 by Joshua Mkabuko Nkomo. And then on the other side, there was also Zimbabwe African National Union, ZANU, which also split in 1975 between ZANU PF and ZANU Ndonga. Right, so after that, of course, in 1953, Zimbabwe, now Britain, creates the Central African Federation that was made up of Southern Rhodesia, which is, of course, current-day Zimbabwe, Northern Rhodesia, which is Zambia, and Nyasaland, which is Malawi. So, of course, that federation later on broke up. That was now in 1963. So the federation breaks up when now Zambia and Malawi gains independence before Zimbabwe. Now in 1980, Zimbabwe officially gains independence and Robert Mugabe becomes the country's first prime minister. Now in 1987, the constitution is changed and now it changes from Mugabe being the country's first prime minister to the country's first president. Moving on now, of course, just still looking at the elections. Now, this particular elections in 2023, the number of presidential candidates were 11, and one of them was a woman. As earlier said in the report, of course, the number of registered voters is 6.62 million voters. And what does it say? Of course, this particular presidential election needs more than 50% for a person to win. Now, also it says that if there is no particular winner, in this presidential election in 2023, another runoff will be done. That is, of course, after 6 weeks, and it has been scheduled for 2nd of October. Moving on now, let's take a look at the main candidates. Now, there are 11 candidates, but 2 of the main candidates are the main ones, really, and that is, of course, the current president, that is Emmerson Mnangagwa. Emmerson Mnangagwa has been nicknamed the crocodile. In the local language, he's known as Ngwena. This is, of course, just going back in history when he was fighting for independence in Zimbabwe. And it is said that he is politically cunning and he led a particular group during that time when they were fighting for independence that called itself the Crocodile Gang. Now, let's talk about him just a bit more. He, of course, was born on 15th of February 1946, as we have seen earlier on. But let's just continue and see what else he did as he was coming up to this particular role. Now, he was released after serving his sentence, and he was deported to Zambia, where he studied law. In 1977, he was elected special assistant to Mugabe, and then at the same time, he was the head of civil and military divisions of ZANU PF. Remember, ZANU PF is one of the main parties up until now. In 1980, of course, when they gained independence, and Prime Minister at the time, Robert Mugabe, he became the first Minister of National Security. In 1988 to 2000, he became the Minister of Justice, Legal and Paramilitary Affairs. Moving on now, in the year 2000 also, he became a speaker in parliament after he lost a parliamentary seat, and he was given that role by the then president, of course, that was Robert Mugabe. In the year 2008, he became a defense minister. This also, again, is still under the rule of Robert Mugabe. Now, after that, he became a vice president, and that is between 2014 and 2017. But up until this particular point, he was still in good terms with Robert Mugabe. But on 6th November, that particular year, he did not, they were not on the same page with Robert Mugabe, and he was thrown out of that particular role, of course, as a vice president. And he actually fled the country because at the time he was fearing for his life. But 2 weeks later, Robert Mugabe was actually removed as the party leader in the ZANU PF and was replaced by Emmerson Mnangagwa. Now, in 2017, he became the country's president after a coup d'etat. And of course, this is after Robert Mugabe now resigned and officially left his role as the president after 37 years. And in 2023, of course, in this particular year, he's the presidential candidate under the party ZANU PF. I want us now to go to the next candidate, and the next candidate is known as Nelson Chamisa. And among the people in Zimbabwe, he's known as the young man or Mukomana, of course referring to him as a young person and who's been fighting for some of the rights of people in Zimbabwe. But let's just take a look at some of the facts about him. He was born on 2nd February 1978 in Matsvigo in Harare. He studied law and political science at the University of Zimbabwe. He holds a degree in theology, and he was a former Secretary General of the Zimbabwe National Students Union. And up until this point, of course, that's when his political career just started kicking off. And in 1999, he joined the Movement for Democratic Change, that is MDC. And then in 2003, he became the youngest member of parliament at the age of 25. In 2006, he was elected the MDC Alliance spokesman. Remember, MDC is the Movement for Democratic Change that at the time was being led by Morgan Tsvangirai. In 2009 to 2013, he became the ICT minister during the Government of National Unity. Now, Government of National Unity, of course, this was the time when Morgan Tsvangirai and the then president, of course, Robert Mugabe, were in the same coalition. But of course, that brought in a lot of issues here and there. In 2016, though, he became the co-vice president of the MDC party. And then in 2018, he became the acting leader or president of MDC after Morgan Tsvangirai's death. Of course, if you remember, in 2018, Morgan Tsvangirai was suffering from colon cancer and he lost his life at that particular time. Then in the same year, there were elections held. That was on 30th July 2018, and Chamisa lost that disputed election to Mnangagwa. Of course, in this particular election in 2018, he strongly disputed it and said that the results were fake and that they were not free and fair. Now, 2023, he's also on the ballot again as a presidential candidate, this time around with a different party, that is the Citizens Coalition for Change, CCC, or if you like, CCC. Now, I want us to look at the policy differences between the two main candidates. Of course, that's Emmerson Mnangagwa and Nelson Chamisa. Now, Emmerson Mnangagwa, who is the current president, of course, he's talking about economic recovery. This particular country is suffering quite much when it comes to hyperinflation and high level of unemployment. Number two, another point for his policy is investment promotion and, of course, also infrastructure development in terms of development of the country and building the country in the best way possible when it comes to development. And, of course, number four, tackling corruption. Corruption has been a big issue in Zimbabwe. Okay, number two again, Nelson Chamisa. Of course, he's the second main candidate. We want to look at his policy differences, and they're just 3 pointers. And of course, job creation is point number one. Like I had said earlier, there's a very high level of unemployment in that particular country. And so as a young person, he's trying to create jobs for people. Number two, social justice, just to make sure that there's access to everything, whether it is hospital care or is access to education, and making sure everybody has a free, fair right in whatever it is. Number three, of course, part of his policy differences is democratic governance and making sure that everything is in the right way. Now, I want us to take a look finally at the issues in Zimbabwe's elections. There are a couple of issues in Zimbabwe, of course, economy being one of them. Like I initially said, one of the issues, of course, is high level of unemployment. The local currency actually is losing a lot of value when it comes, or when it's against the dollars. Some of the other issues, of course, is hyperinflation. And another thing, when you talk to the locals actually in that particular region in Harare, you find that half of the population is currently living in extreme poverty. I want us to go to the next point, which is regional stability. Now, of course, when it comes to regional stability, when a country is in political instability, there's, of course, violence, corruption, and that, of course, has led to a lot of leaders and locals moving back to other countries, or rather going to other countries, flooding countries like South Africa, Botswana, and Zambia, just to make sure that they're able to get a living. Right, I just want us, before we continue with the issues there in Zimbabwe, I want us to talk to a reporter in Harare. I want to talk to Chris Chinaka. Chris, Chris, if you can hear me, good evening to you. I want you to talk to us about how today went, of course, as an election day in Zimbabwe, and was there misinformation reported today? Chris, if you can hear me. Chris Chinaka is a fact checker in Zimbabwe, and I want us to talk about how, of course, election was being held today and if there were any misinformation reported during today's election. Chris? Right, let's try one more time to see if we can get to Chris. Chris Chinaka, if you can hear me very well, he is a fact checker based in Zimbabwe, and we want to know how the election was today and if there were any malpractices or misinformation reported during today's election. Chris? I think we might not be able to get him because of some technical issues. But of course, like I was talking about earlier, some of the issues that Zimbabwe is facing, away from economy, the regional stability, other pointers, of course, was transparency and integrity of the process, that is the election process. And of course, social services, there's no access to healthcare in the country. The education and basic services is also missing in that country. And actually, the current president is blaming the Western countries for imposing sanctions that has led to this country being in that particular economic state. And of course, finally, there is corruption. Corruption is a very big issue in Zimbabwe. And if you saw, there's a documentary that was aired on that was talking about how gold is being smuggled into Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe, of course, is Africa's 6th largest gold producer. Right, of course, that's what we had for you when it comes to today's election day in Zimbabwe. We'll be following up, of course, tomorrow and see what the results will be from that particular country. My name is Fatihia Mohammed Noor. News Hour is up next.